Good evening, everyone. My name is Carla Reyes, and I am a member of the Central Committee of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'm speaking to you today from New York City, and I'll be chairing tonight's event. We're going to begin our program in just a moment, but before we do, I'd like to ask everyone right now who's watching to click on that share button to let all your friends know about this live stream and help us get our message to a bigger audience. Waiting for all those clicks to happen. Thank you. I first want to open up honoring a worker struggle that has recently taken place. A sanitation worker strike in New Orleans has entered its second week. Hoppers, a term that describes the workers who hop out of the garbage trucks when collecting trash, are demanding hazard pay and PPE during the pandemic. Instead of meeting the workers' demands, the staffing agency that employs the hoppers instead signed a contract with a private company to hire work release inmates at 13% less than what the strikers were getting paid in the first place to replace these workers. Once the prison labor contractor, Lock 5, discovered that they were involved in a labor dispute, they quickly pulled out of the contract. The necessity of sanitation workers, especially during a public health crisis, is without question. Garbage collection is already a high-risk job, and no one with such a critical role should have to subject themselves to greater harm in order to satisfy the greed of business owners. We stand with the striking sanitation workers in New Orleans in their struggle for better pay and protection. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the actions that we do as a party, as the PSL. On April 25th, car caravans in over 40 cities raised the slogan, "Cancel the rent and mortgages," to highlight how during a pandemic, workers who have lost their jobs and been furloughed can't expect to pay rent. With rent and mortgages coming due again in a couple of weeks, the government continues to refuse to take critical action in the interest of the majority of people. Over 33 million people have filed officially for unemployment. The government has given billions and billions to banks and corporations and made unprecedented reforms, but none of them have been for the working class. They should cancel the rent and mortgages and give widespread relief during this pandemic. So I invite you all to join the PSL again on Saturday, May 30th in cities across the country to demand that federal, state, and local governments immediately cancel rents and mortgages. Visit canceltherents.org to sign the petition today, as well as find updated information on the May 30th actions. Now I want to talk a little bit about our programming for today. As news of unceasing police terror and police harassment spreads around all corners of the country, the extreme disproportionality in the arrest and treatment of Black and Latino people during the COVID-19 crisis becomes more and more clear. While many people of color have been targeted for violating stay-at-home orders, white reactionaries continue to demonstrate, threatening all public safety with little or no interference from the police. Today's webinar is titled, "Coronavirus and the Epidemic of Racism in Capitalist America." It will feature several PSL organizers who will provide a political analysis of and organizing updates from the movements confronting recent injustices that stem from structural racism in Georgia, Ohio, Louisiana, New York, North Carolina, and Indianapolis, as well as the racist attacks against Asian people and the struggle of the Sioux Nation in South Dakota. Our program will also include critical commentary on the increased oppression people of color face in the United States in the midst of the coronavirus crisis. Now, it's time to begin our program. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Eugene Puryear. Eugene is a member of the Central Committee of the PSL and author of Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America, as well as co-host of Breakthrough News. He's speaking to us from New York City. Welcome, Eugene.
Well, thank you, Carla. I appreciate your introduction there, and certainly I'm very happy to be here with the rest of the co-panelists for the PSL live stream this evening, certainly very aptly titled. The Pandemic of Racism is certainly right in front of our face here, the epidemic of racism, whatever it's called. Nevertheless, I think that it's very clear that the rot at the core of the system here in the United States, that is the racist oppression of Black people, that's been built on since, well, not 1619 actually, since the 1500s, in what we call the United States now, when the first Africans came here. It's been essential to the rise of capitalism, it's been essential to the maintenance of capitalism, and certainly as capitalism has entered its sort of last 30 or 40 years and tried to globalize and become ever more imperialistic and ever more brutal, there has also been the intense warehousing of the Black population as we've become more and more superfluous to the neoliberal capitalist plans to dominate the world. And we've had quite a bit of occasion to see this in the past few weeks. I mean, certainly, we'll speak about many of these incidents here tonight, but whether it be the issue of the garbage workers, the hoppers in New Orleans, who were at least briefly in their strike replaced by prison labor, which certainly is reminiscent of the long history in Louisiana and in the South of the use of prison labor, not just as a strike breaker, but also to open up some of the most dangerous, most brutal industries, whether it be mining, the turpentine camps, the lumber industry. We could go on and on and on, but that history of the use of Black prisoners as, really the shock troops of capitalism, the most expendable on the front lines for, the worst employers, quite frankly, continuing today. Whether it be the murder of Ahmad Arbery, who in the county where he was killed in Georgia during the heyday of lynching between the Civil War and World War II, there were 3 other incidents of Black people whose bodies were riddled with bullets and brutally mutilated and lynched, and the echoes of that history coming down through certainly the lynch mob type situations we've seen in a couple different cities, the multiple police killings that we've seen in Indianapolis in recent days, and also just the overall issue of underlying conditions, so-called underlying conditions as they exist in the United States, that have disproportionately, or that have led to Black communities in many cities, especially in the Midwest and other places in the South, be disproportionately hit in terms of the death rate of COVID-19. And, it's treated as some sort of random thing that just people happen to have underlying conditions. But that benign way of discussing it really does absolutely nothing at all to illuminate the fact that, so-called underlying conditions are the results of predatory industries that have addicted people to all sorts of terrible substances, that have done whatever they possibly can to replace fresh and healthy food with the worst possible but cheapest terrible foods, that have created an outright health crisis. I mean, we call many places food deserts, and it's a food desert because there's a lack of healthy food, not because they're not things that you can eat, but the things that are available to you are so destructive to your system. The high rates of asthma from the unbelievable inequalities that exist inside of how power is generated in this country, inside of how waste is dumped in this country, inside of how environmental regulations seem to be the laxest in these many places like, say, Cancer Alley in Louisiana. So ultimately, so many of these things that are considered underlying conditions are not even about the individual people in and of themselves, but the circumstances of structural racism in which they live. And I think that as we continue here tonight on our live stream, we will see that this epidemic of racism is, certainly taking on its own reality here in the time of a pandemic, in the time of COVID-19, but that this is really just another exposure of the just disgusting rot at the center of this capitalist system in the United States, which is racism. So I'll just leave it there. Certainly looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say here this evening, and certainly very happy that you were able to join us here. So much appreciation, of course, to Carla for introducing me again. And again, just really happy to be here and happy to be a part of it.
Thank you, Eugene. To hear more from Eugene, you can watch Breakthrough News on YouTube and follow the show on Twitter at BT Newsroom. Next, we will hear from Esteban Hernandez. Esteban is a Central Committee member of the PSL, and he's speaking to us from Atlanta. Please welcome Esteban.
Thank you, Carla. I'm here to speak with everybody today about the lynching and murder of Ahmad Arbery. Ahmad was a young 25-year-old man. His best friend, Akeem Baker, described him as a shining light in a dark world. His mother, Wanda Cooper Jones, and father, Marcus Arbery Sr., have been on the media recently speaking about how the murder of their son has turned their lives upside down and destroyed it. Last Friday, May 8th, Ahmad would have turned 26 years old. He had his whole life ahead of himself. And if you've ever lost a family member, you know the pain that they're going through. What happened was that on Sunday, February 23rd at 1 p.m., Ahmad was jogging in the Shatilla Shores neighborhood of Brunswick, Georgia, just like he had done many times before because he's an athlete. But this time, Greg McMichael and his son, Travis McMichael, armed with a shotgun and pistol, pursued Ahmad in a truck, shooting him, confronting him, and shooting him 3 times, twice in the chest. Ahmad was killed there on the scene. There's 2 crimes that took place. First is the lynching by the McMichaels, and the second is the attempted cover-up. The first DA that took the case, Jackie Johnson, had the video evidence in hand. She had the video evidence, but made no arrests and pressed no charges. She later recused herself. The second DA to take on the case, George Barnhill, the Waycross district attorney, begrudgingly recused himself because his son had worked for years in the same office as as Greg McMichael. Greg McMichael had been for years an investigator in the district attorney's office. He was also a former police officer, so he knew many of these different people. But before recusing himself, George Barnhill, the DA, put out a letter, a disgusting letter, in which he puts forward the defense for the McMichaels. He says that the McMichaels were doing what he called a citizen's arrest and were well within their rights. But in order to make a citizen's arrest, an individual must see firsthand a felony crime taking place or have immediate knowledge of that crime having taken place. They had no such knowledge. The McMichaels merely said Ahmad looked suspicious and looked similar to someone who had supposedly done a string of robberies recently in the neighborhood. We recently found out that there wasn't even a string of robberies that had taken place. The DA, George Barnhill, goes on to say that the McMichaels were acting in self-defense and stood their ground. But you can't act in self-defense if you're the instigator. If they were pursuing Ahmad and confronted Ahmad, that is not self-defense. In the same letter, George Barnhill goes on to even question the mental stability of Ahmad Arbery. But this all has to be understood within the context of white supremacy woven into the fabric of the state of Georgia. I'd like to read a quote from one of the family lawyers, Benjamin Crump. He said, "We've been here before. Tamir Rice or Trayvon Martin, when they kill our children, they then try to assassinate their character, and I know they're going to do the same with Ahmad." Lynchings have a deep history and tradition in the state of Georgia and in this country. During Jim Crow, in this state alone, there was 589 lynchings in Georgia, second only to Mississippi. Out of all the lynchings that took place in the South after 1900, only 1% resulted in convictions. There's not even to this day a hate crimes bill on the books in Georgia. It's one of the only 4 states in the country with no hate crimes bill, with no hate crimes law. And this extends beyond lynchings. You can see it in all facets of life. For example, 83% of all hospitalizations to COVID-19 are from the African American community in Georgia. Yet, Black people are only 32% of the entire population. I want to leave you with this. Racism is alive and well. We know this to be true, but we have to go out and fight. This Saturday, there's going to be a rally at the Glynn County Courthouse at 2 p.m. We will be there, and we call on everybody to come out and support. If you're against racism, and if you're against what has happened, join us. We must stop racism before it goes on. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteban. That's really powerful. And if you are in the area, I truly encourage you to join the action. Next, I would like to introduce Kimberly Smith. Kim is an organizer with the PSL speaking to us from South Carolina. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you, Carla. There's a war on Black America. It didn't start with the presidency of Donald Trump. It didn't start with the crisis caused by the government's refusal to plan for the coronavirus pandemic. But the crisis has for sure brought an intensification of that war. We are subjected to police terror on a daily basis. The racist enforcement of stay-at-home orders and the economic depression caused by the crisis are resulting in increased police terror inflicted on Black and brown and working class people. Looking back on the history of policing, it is more than apparent that these officers who supposedly uphold law and order harken back to the days of the slave catchers. In fact, the roots of police organizations in the United States are found in the slave patrols. The first slave patrol actually formed in my home state of South Carolina in the early 1700s. Members of slave patrols could forcefully enter anyone's home based on suspicions that they were harboring someone who had escaped slavery. Slave patrols supposedly formally dissolved after the Civil War. However, Black people were still subjected to racist policing with the enacting of Black codes and other laws that were put in place for the purpose of controlling Black people. Actual police departments began to form in the early 19th century, starting out in Boston and spreading to New York City, Albany, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and other places across the country. The police forces were mostly white and male, and the officers were hired to control a dangerous underclass that disproportionately consisted of Black people, immigrants, and poor. Sound familiar? Today, we are witnessing an uptick in police and white supremacist brutality in the Carolinas and elsewhere. On March 13th, police, acting just like their slave patrol predecessors, rushed into Breonna Taylor's home in the middle of the night, startling her and her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. Walker thought that their home had been broken into, and out of fear and trying to protect his family, opened fire. Instead of police announcing themselves, they opened fire and relentlessly murdered Breonna Taylor. She was only 26 years old at the time of her murder by the racist police force. Breonna Taylor was an EMT, trained to be a nurse working on the front lines of the pandemic. The police were looking for someone who didn't even live in the apartment complex. Their callous disregard for Black lives ended in Taylor's murder. Racist mobs are not a thing of the past. They are still alive and well. Just a few weeks ago, on May 3rd in Wilmington, North Carolina, a sheriff led an angry mob into the home of the Shepherd family, supposedly in search of a missing girl. It is only the strength and presence of Damian Shepherd and his mother Monica that repelled the police and led the police-led mob and ensured, with community support, that Deputy Sheriff Keita lost his job in a rare act of accountability for police racism and brutality. Now, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we see even more the lengths that this racist state will go to harass, terrorize Black people. Comrades, we must come together and rise up against a system that has continuously proven that Black people are not seen as human, that we are not deserving of basic human rights like bodily autonomy and self-determination. We must create a new society based on overcoming oppression and building equality for all. And that starts with calling out and standing against police terror and racism. That starts with standing firmly against anti-Black police violence by any means necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Now, before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to ask everyone watching right now to click on that share button. Help us spread the message on all your social media platforms. Now, I would like to introduce Kirby Joseph. Kirby is a member of the Central Committee of the PSL and a Safe Outside the System coordinator at the Audre Lorde Project. She is speaking to us from New York City. Welcome, Kirby.
Hi, thank you for having me. Thank you, Carla, for chairing and doing an awesome job. Thank you to all the speakers that came before me. Even though police brutality has existed before the pandemic, it has now taken a different character. Abusive pandemic policing has been wrapped in a farce messaging of public health for our quote-unquote wellness. Multiple videos and news accounts emerge daily of the NYPD brutalizing and abusing New Yorkers under the continued disguise of social distancing enforcement. Like the case of a 9-year-old boy that was savagely beaten and arrested for selling candy on a train with his mother. Unsurprisingly, the limited data released have revealed that vast majority of enforcement-related summons and arrests are disproportionately Black and brown people. And while we know the truth of who is being affected by social distancing enforcement, New York City Mayor de Blasio continues to lie, saying that the numbers and summons are extraordinarily low, that there's a huge amount of restraint by the NYPD. CBS local news reported, in fact, that the NYPD had 1 million contacts between March 16th to May 5th, just a few days ago. That led to 374 summonses, 120 arrests. Breaking down arrests by race, 68% are Black, 24% have been brown Latino folks, and nearly 7% were white. Of summonses, 193 were Black, 111 were brown, 51 were white, and 14 were Asian. Overall, 93% of arrests, or 116 out of 125 people, were people of color. In Brooklyn alone, 7 out of 8 people arrested were Black, while Black Brooklynites only make up 34% of Brooklyn. De Blasio was the one that gave the NYPD carte blanche to aggressively enforce social distancing in the first place. Yet he says that he can fix the problem. An article written by Elisa Velasco explained that in the meantime, the pandemic mistreatment, there has been at least over 100 NYPD officers who tested positive for COVID-19. Out of the 98 cases were positive, 70% of them were, sorry, comrades. I hate being on camera, okay. 70% of them were among uniformed officers, while 28 are citizen members of the department. Many officers are not wearing any PPE, while they violently round up Black and brown community members. There is a clear class disposability to the NYPD pandemic of violence as well. For the first time in the history of New York City subway stations and system, the entire train system has been shut down. And this happened on May 6th from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. Clearing and disinfecting the train system is critical. However, there was a forced homelessness of people outside in the middle of the night while the city refuses to offer meaningful, safe ways to house homeless people in New York City. During the pandemic, poor working class people have experienced devastating cuts to public health, social services, safety net, education, jobs via job freezes, and SYEP, which is youth summer programs. However, the NYPD $6 billion budget was not impacted in the same way at all. Many agencies have been put on hiring freezes while the NYPD has not. In fact, the NYPD budget has allowed enough room to hire 1,000 more police officers during this pandemic to further terrorize our communities. The $6 billion NYPD budget allows the expansion of violence police presence in social services like homeless outreach, mental health response, youth initiative, and social distancing, all of which the NYPD has showed that they have failed at, even before the pandemic. So what can be done? The $6 billion NYPD budget should be reallocated to the continued need of poor working class people, period. End the policing that allows the NYPD to terrorize our communities, halt the enforcement of low-level offenses during the pandemic. New York City cannot police its way out of the COVID-19 pandemic. It just can't happen. Creative solutions, not budget cuts, are what's needed. For example, Public health professionals and community organizations should be tasked to respectively educate New Yorkers about the importance of social distancing and help create new forms and new norms that will protect everyone while mass testing is implemented. We know our neighborhoods, how to interact with our communities. It is clear that even in times of crisis, the NYPD is not the answer. They don't serve our interests. They only serve the interests of the ruling class. And because we serve our interests, we are at task to do this work. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Kirby, for that powerful talk. You know, I'm a teacher in New York City, and to see the public school budget get slashed right now while the NYPD budget isn't cut at all is really infuriating. So next we're gonna hear from Derek Ford. Derek is an organizer with the PSL and a professor at DePaul University. He's speaking to us from Indianapolis. So please welcome Derek.
Thanks, Carla. So just after 6 p.m. on Wednesday, May 8th, the cops started chasing Drayshawn Reed on the highway, alleging that he was speeding. Drayshawn managed to make it off the highway and into the north side, where he bolted from his car and was running for his life. He was live streaming the entire time and begging for help, begging for people to come get him. And as he was running away from the cops tasered him twice and then fired at least 12 rounds at him. The cops didn't know that he was live streaming. And so on the live stream, you can hear the cops walk up to his body. And one cop says, "It looks like it's gonna be a closed casket, homie," to the other cop's laughter. At a press conference afterwards, the police chief said that there was no reason to believe that the cops did anything wrong when they killed Drayshawn. But the people definitely disagreed and immediately took to the streets. Our party joined the protest a few hours later and stayed in the streets with the people that night, meeting Drayshawn's family and community members and leaders in the neighborhood. The cops, by the way, didn't move Drayshawn's body for hours. And in fact, his body was still on the ground when just 4 hours later at 10 p.m. that same day, the cops killed again. An officer was driving his car to work, and when he was about to get on the highway, he hit and killed a pedestrian, a 23-year-old white woman named Ashlyn Lisby, and the child that she was carrying. And then just 3 hours later, at 1 a.m. the next day, May 7th, officers shot and killed Mikhail Rose, a 19-year-old Black man on the city's north side. The cops say they received a report of a burglary in progress and identified Rose as a suspect and claim he fired at them when they tried to apprehend him. So the cops killed 3 people in less than 8 hours in Indianapolis. At noon that day, May 8th, there was a large protest on the north side near where Drayshawn was killed. Our party helped prepare for the action because the organizers that we had met the night before asked to use our sound system. They asked us to help make flyers and placards. We quickly took over the intersection with hundreds of people who continued to come throughout the day, despite the numerous cops who were armed with pepper spray bullets. Together, we were able to summon the chief of police to the protest so that the community leaders and Drayshawn's father and sister, Jamie and Jasmine Reed, could confront him. The chief offered only excuses, which didn't go over well with the people, and he quickly retreated. On Saturday, there was another protest. Our party was there again. One of our comrades was leading a team of street medics, and the cops were determined to prevent people from taking the streets. When one person was using a crosswalk to cross the street, cops swarmed him and arrested him for obstructing traffic. And in the middle of a respiratory disease pandemic, they shot balls of pepper spray at the crowd. But the protest didn't die down because when people heard about it, when they saw the footage, they joined the protests. And this obviously isn't the first time Indy cops have killed, and it isn't the first time the movement against police murder here has emerged. In the past few years, the movement's gained a lot of experience and knowledge about how the system really works. When the cops killed Aaron Bailey in 2017, the movement fought for an independent prosecutor, but the independent prosecutor cleared the cops of any wrongdoing. And so the movement now isn't being placated by any promises of the politicians. We're demanding that the officers involved be named, be fired, be indicted, and be convicted. And we'll stay in the streets until that happens, because it's in the streets and not in the courts where we'll get real justice. Thanks, Carla. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Derek. It's really, really great to hear all the work that's being done on this case. So next I would like to introduce Tina No. Tina is an organizer with the PSL, and she's speaking to us from Philadelphia. Please welcome Tina.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you to all the speakers. Really good to be joining everyone tonight from Philly. As millions of people across America continue to be impacted by the coronavirus outbreak, many of us continue living in fear due to the increase of xenophobic and racist acts against different communities. COVID-19 related bigotry has led to a sharp rise in hate crimes and racial harassment, specifically against Asian people. So reports of Asian people receiving threats, getting spit on and coughed at in the streets, attacked with acid and stabbed while grocery shopping have been plaguing the news. Asians receiving messages such as, go back to China and being blamed for bringing the virus here, in addition to the coronavirus itself being referred to as the Kung flu or Chinese virus, and people spreading false information about what wet markets are have deeply affected our communities. People fear for themselves and their loved ones. I know I certainly do, because we're unsure of exactly when they're going to be the one that's targeted. The surge in anti-Asian discrimination has especially impacted Asian women who've reported between 2 or 3 times more instances of harassment and violence than men in the past several weeks. But these are not just isolated incidents or random acts of aggression that spurted out of nowhere. Racism is a systemic issue, and anti-Asian racism is not a new phenomena. It just so happens that the coronavirus has exacerbated the dangers that our communities have to face in our everyday life. The Trump administration and their anti-Chinese campaign have mobilized American racists to personally take up the task of targeting Asian people. Top government officials and the corporate media are shamelessly spreading the completely baseless conspiracy theory that the Chinese government purposely unleashed the coronavirus on the world, which is just totally untrue and false. And while it's true that the Trump administration has fueled anti-Asian sentiments, the problem isn't uniquely Trumpism. Joe Biden made an entire fear-mongering ad scapegoating Chinese people for their little elite electoral games, claiming how Trump is, quote, too soft on China. And if it was Biden, the ad claims he would make it clear that the Chinese people would, that the Americans would be in China right now, and that he would be demanding the country to open and be transparent about the coronavirus. The issue is China has been transparent, and they've been earning international praises for it. The Chinese government has taken necessary steps in battling both the virus and the imperialist-led disinformation campaign against it. Meanwhile, the US remains as the epicenter of the outbreak. And while the Democrats have criticized Trump for being xenophobic, its presidential candidate Biden has gone on national television calling it the Wuhan virus. Racism is a strategic weapon by the ruling class, by both the Democratic Party and the GOP, to exercise control over all aspects of society. And racism is despicable and should not be tolerated in any form. Blaming a particular group of people for a medical crisis is not a new phenomenon in the United States. And specifically with Asians, we've confronted a long legacy of exclusion and hatred in America, particularly during periods of immigration, of changing demographics, of economic instability and war. In spite of historic linguistic differences, distinct Asian nationalities, we've been grouped together and treated similarly. And the history of the United States cannot be told without the mentions of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of hundreds of thousands of Japanese during the World War II, imperialism in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, the Philippines, etc., and its ongoing economic and cultural war against China, in addition to its incitement of anti-Asian racism during a global pandemic, one of the most vulnerable times in recent history. The best antidote to COVID-19 and to anti-Asian Asian racism is solidarity with the Asian communities and Asian nations, and also public health practices to manage the epidemic. We must have all hands on deck to uproot racism and fight for international cooperation. Thank you again to Carla and the rest of the panelists tonight. It's really good to be joining everyone.
Thank you, Tina. In the PSL, we are going to continue to fight against anti-Asian bigotry. Next, I would like to introduce Sweta Karetti. Sweta is an organizer with the PSL and is speaking to us from Cleveland, Ohio. So I will pass the camera on to Sweta.
Thank you so much, Carla, for that introduction, and thank you so much to the other comrades on this panel. Ohio has been prominent in the mainstream news for groups of right-wing protesters openly violating stay-at-home orders. On April 20th, a group of about 100, mostly white dissidents, arrived at the Ohio State Capitol to voice their opposition to the stay-at-home orders. Not a single person was arrested, despite being heavily armed and an obvious violation of large gatherings in public. Meanwhile, Black Ohioans are 4 times more likely to be charged with violating the stay-at-home order than white Ohioans. This racist double standard of enforcement of the stay-at-home order is clearly not about protecting public safety. It is just another excuse for a racist police force to violently control and surveil Black people. Institutional racism that the other comrades on this panel have so brilliantly articulated means that the pandemic response has made communities of color in Ohio even more vulnerable to COVID-19. As of May 12, Black people accounted for 28.9% of COVID cases and 16.7% of COVID deaths in the state, but only make up about 14.3% of the state population. In some counties, these percentages are even higher, yet testing is lower among Ohioans of color when compared to their white counterparts. Ohio is home to world-renowned healthcare and research institutions such as the Cleveland Clinic, which brings in about $8.4 billion in annual revenue. But PPE and antibody testing is scarce even for healthcare professionals, much less civilians. Despite this, Governor DeWine has ordered the reopening of the Ohio economy, including restaurants, beauty parlors, and malls, albeit at a limited capacity. The reopening of these sectors and safety enforcement poses a unique threat to women of color, particularly Black and Latino women who are overrepresented in these industries. In Ohio, Governor DeWine's leadership has been lauded. In fact, his daily briefings have become a meme, Wine with DeWine. Far from this benevolent visage, DeWine is an extremist conservative politician who is using this pandemic as an opportunity to further his own ideological agenda. Reproductive injustice is a hallmark of his administration. DeWine used the pandemic to declare abortion as an elective procedure, which put the lives of many people in jeopardy and disproportionately impacted women of color. The Party for Socialism and Liberation strongly denounces this disgusting act of political opportunism and blatant attack on women. ICE arrests in Ohio continue on business as usual despite the pandemic, and the situation in Ohio's 4 ICE detention facilities is dire. Ohio already has a long history of human rights violations in its prison and jail systems, and this is something that even the Department of Justice has repeatedly investigated and called for rehabilitation of. The situation under COVID-19 has only exacerbated this crisis. Currently, 39,000 people are in quarantine in Ohio's prison system, and worsening conditions in facilities across the state have been documented by incarcerated people, either themselves posting videos to social media or through the work of campaigns such as Free Them All. Since May 6th, 85 incarcerated people at Marion Correctional Institution have been on a hunger strike to protest the inhumane conditions of their incarceration. The Ohio state government won't do what's needed, but organizers and community members have kept up the pressure. PSL comrades throughout Ohio have been organizing phone zaps that target egregious landlords and property managers. We have been working with numerous community organizations to fight for people's needs and call out injustice. Though this pandemic has both heightened the struggle and presented new and unexpected challenges to our organizing, we are committed to continue to escalate our agitation, empower our communities, and of course, build socialism. Thank you so much, Carla, and to the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Swetha. Our final speaker tonight is Gloria La Riva. Gloria is a founding member of the PSL and a longtime activist in the movement for socialism. She's also the PSL's 2020 presidential candidate, along with vice presidential running mate and political prisoner Leonard Peltier. She is speaking to us from San Francisco and will be closing the program today. Welcome, Gloria.
Thank you, Carla. Sisters and brothers, hello. I want to thank all the speakers for your inspiring words. It's so great to know also that PSL members will be driving 5 hours from Atlanta to Brunswick, Georgia this weekend to be in solidarity with Ahmad Arbery's family and community. I was so touched and so saddened when I saw one of his boyhood friends in the birthday memorial for him a few days ago, and his friend said, Ahmad used to always say, bro, I'm gonna make it big. I don't know how, but I'm gonna make it big someday. This is not a fight just for his family and his community. This is a national struggle. And although many of us can't be there, we're there in spirit. The war against Black America has never let up since this country's founding. Racism is fomented, especially at times in history when the exploiters feel their control slipping. The defeated slavocracy overthrew Reconstruction, imposed Black code laws, and used Klan and lynching terror and divide and conquer to assure their dominance, power, and wealth. Fast forward to today, mass incarceration skyrocketed in the 1980s as a byproduct of high technology and the shipping of jobs abroad for maximizing profits. In a frenzy, the politicians across the country created racist myths, imposing extreme sentencing in order to imprison current and future workers. You see, with the tearing down of industrial factories in Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, there was less need for so many workers. And there are still thousands of men and women in prison as a result of that mass incarceration of the 1980s. Trump, he whipped up racism against Mexicans, accusing them of all kinds of crimes. These are the workers we see in the fields during the pandemic, providing food for the whole nation, who are getting sick and dying by work in the meatpacking plants. But demonize them, and you can divert attention from the real criminals, the bankers, the corporations, the militarists. You can get away with stealing their kids and putting them in cages while you lock up the parents. Trump and the ruling class are using racism in the most vile way against China and Asian Americans, not only during the pandemic, but as a weapon to justify a war buildup. If before the pandemic, higher rates of Black children and their families suffered from hunger due to poverty, it is starkly more true today, especially with the schools necessarily shut down. And there are literally tens of millions of people with no money, of all nationalities, including white people, including undocumented workers and the families who are not entitled to 1 penny of federal aid. So sisters and brothers, this is all of our fight together. And that's why we're organizing for an even more massive show of car caravans in as many cities as possible on Saturday, May 30th, to demand cancel the rents and the mortgages. And instead of handing over our hard-earned money to a landlord, we demand that the people should have a right to housing. And also we're calling for a cancellation of rents for home buyers, for small landlords and small business. But I also believe that we must have a deeper understanding of the roots of the oppression of African American people, as well as understanding how the genocide of Native peoples plays out to this very day. We need it in order to counter the racist narrative in the media and school textbooks by the capitalists and their politicians, the lies that are conveyed in 1,000 ways, saying that any progress made was only made by white people. It's the myth of divine destiny that allowed the capitalist exploiters to oppress us all, including white working people, not just Black, Latino, Native, Asian, but all people. And I want to recommend two valuable works for reading. One is a new document that was published by the New York Times called the 1619 Project last year. And it's a series of articles to mark the 400 years since the first ship brutally transported millions of kidnapped and enslaved people from Africa to this country. Now, the New York Times is a principal mouthpiece of capitalism. It is the liberal wing of imperialism, and it has been, for example, fiercely reactionary against the Venezuelan struggle. However, the 1619 Project was written and developed by African American scholars who analyze many aspects of white supremacy that the US was founded on and how it has affected the lives of African Americans to this day. One title of one of the articles is, "To understand the brutality of American capitalism, you have to start with the plantation." And the other book that's essential reading to understand the US campaign to exterminate Native peoples is "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee" by Dee Brown. It's very important for any revolutionary's library, for any of us struggling for justice. In 1850, for example, it shows that Native nations controlled almost half of the land that was going to become the United States. By 1886, they controlled virtually nothing. Of course, more land was stolen before 1850. But what happened in those 36 years was relentless war by the US government, led by the cavalry, clearing the way with massacre after massacre to dominate the wide expanse of land on behalf of capitalism. The story of genocide weighs heavily on the present. And so the pandemic has deepened an already extreme, difficult crisis for the Diné Nation, also known as Navajo. The expanse of the Diné Nation is in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, with 175,000 people living on the reservation. It has become one of the hotspots of this pandemic. And although the Diné and all the 19 native pueblos of New Mexico make up 10% of the population of the state, 50% of the COVID cases are Diné. Everyone knows how essential water is, and especially in this crisis, but only 30% of the Diné households have running water. How do you stay safe without running water? The poorest communities with double-digit unemployment, extreme poverty, and short life expectancy are on the reservations. And today, a major struggle is underway in South Dakota with a right-wing governor, Kristi Noem, ordering two of the Lakota nations in that state to take down their road checks that they set up to isolate the Oglala Lakota and the Cheyenne River nations from the virus. Now, the average income on Pine Ridge Reservation, for example, is between $2,600 and $3,500 a year with 90% unemployment. So the situation is dire. And if the Diné Nation is being ravaged by this virus, the other Native nations know that they must defend their people from this virus. And in addition, the healthcare situation is a disaster. In the CARES package that the government passed in April, the Indian health clinics, which are supposed to serve all the Native peoples in the country, urban and rural, are drastically underfunded. And only $1 billion was allotted to the Indian health clinics of the country in the CARES Act. So due to the very remote conditions and the fact that the Cheyenne River Nation, for example, in South Dakota, only has 8 hospital emergency beds in their clinic, the presidents of the Cheyenne River and Pine Ridge reservations decided they would do all they can to protect their people. They set up the checkpoints on the state roads that lead into the reservations to limit who comes in and who goes out. Governor Kristi Noem has ordered both leaders, Julian Bear Runner of the Oglala Lakota and Harold Frazier of the Cheyenne River, to take down the road checks, saying nobody should be impeded driving into or across the reservation. All they're doing is asking if drivers have a temperature and where did they drive in from. This is because in the eastern part of the state, Smithfield Pork Processing Plant, the largest pork plant in the world, in the eastern part, has had more than 1,000 positive cases because of the close working situation of those workers, and some have died. Chase Iron Eyes, who's president, Bear Runner's spokesperson on Pine Ridge, said, Governor Noem's refusal to issue broad stay-at-home orders, to close non-essential businesses, and to stop utility shutoffs and evictions was bad enough during the pandemic. Governor Noem is in no position to issue these threats. No more genocide. We say enough is enough, and we will stand to defend our right to live in our homelands, free from tyranny and free from disease. This is a life or death situation, and we all have a right to life. We agree with that statement, and we're in full solidarity, and our campaign issued a statement in full support of both nations and all the Native nations in this pandemic. Not only is genocide and oppression the history of the United States, but resistance and revolutionary struggle against that oppression is also part of the people's struggle. When American Indian movement was founded by Dennis Banks and Clyde Bellecourt in 1968, it was on the basis of fighting police brutality in Minneapolis. They were inspired by the Black civil rights and liberation movements, in particular the Black Panther Party. And part of that struggle was defending the people at Pine Ridge against the corrupt tribal leadership of the early 1970s, and to defend their traditional ways and land and demand the great wealth that was stolen from them in the Black Hills to be returned to the people. So the persecution of the great Native leader, political prisoner Leonard Peltier, is because he and other AIM members were protecting the elders and children at Pine Ridge. He's innocent, but he's paying a terrible price, being behind bars more than 44 years, and we are part of that struggle for his freedom. The road is long, sisters and brothers, but people are getting in motion. And even as we have to keep safe, we are creating new ways to protest and educate and agitate. The key is to unite all the people against racism and all discrimination, to fight for true liberation, to fight for socialism. So again, the next step is Saturday, May 30th, with the car caravans to demand cancel the rents and the mortgages. And remember the web, canceltherents.org. Thank you. And thank you, Carla.
Thank you, Gloria. To hear more from Gloria, you can sign up for campaign updates by visiting larivapeltier2020.org or follow the campaign on Twitter at larivapeltier. I want to thank each of our presenters for joining us today and speaking to our viewers. Before we end the webinar, I want to leave you with 3 next steps. 1, join the PSL on May 30th in cities across the country to demand that federal, state, and local governments immediately cancel rents and mortgages, all of them. Visit canceltherents.org to sign a petition today, as well as find updated information on the Saturday, May 30th actions. 2, join us next Thursday, May 21st at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Pacific Time for another public webinar featuring a socialist analysis you won't find anywhere else. And 3, be sure to follow us on social media at PSL Web and visit liberationnews.org for our socialist take on all current events. And remember, thinking about socialism is good, thinking and talking about socialism is better, but building a revolutionary socialist party is best of all. If you're interested in joining the PSL, and I hope you are after this amazing webinar, you can apply online today at pslweb.org/join. Thank you all for tuning in today, and have a great rest of the day.